Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Whoop podcast. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop. We're on a mission to unlock human performance. This week's episode, Whoop VP of Performance Science, our fearless principal scientist, Kristen Holmes, is joined by fitness expert Brad Schoenfeld. Brad is widely regarded as one of the leading authorities on body composition training. He's a lifetime drug-free bodybuilder and has won numerous natural bodybuilding titles. Brad is the best-selling author of multiple fitness books, including The Max Muscle Plan, which is widely referred to as the Muscle Building Bible, and Strong and Sculpt, which details a cutting-edge body sculpting program targeted to women. In total, Brad's books have sold over 500,000 copies. Kristen and Brad will discuss the definition of muscle hypertrophy and resistance training. They also touch on the benefits of both and how it impacts your short and long-term health, how to create and get started on a resistance training program, workout recommendations for various age groups. Did you know children as young as 5 or 6 can lift weights if properly supervised? I didn't know that. The optimal recovery times for muscle groups, how to balance your nutritional and cardio needs with a resistance training program, and the idea of progressive overload. I'm also excited to share we've got a whole new slate of Whoop blue light blocking glasses. That's right, they're back, they're in stock, we got new ones. We've also got a new fully adjustable sleep mask. The benefits of blue light blocking glasses are that they increase your recovery. I'm obsessed with them. I've been wearing them for years. They truly improve your recovery, your sleep. You wear them 30 to 90 minutes before bed, and you just feel way better getting into bed. If you're looking to join Whoop, you can sign up for free. How about that? Free 30-day trial. Try Whoop. If you like it, become a member. If you don't, send it back, and you're all good. Alternatively, use the code WILL, W-I-L-L, sign up for a Whoop membership, and get $60 credit on apparel and accessories, bands, battery packs, and more. That's the code WILL, W-I-L-L. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us, podcast@whoop.com. Call us, 508-443-4952. We'll answer your questions in a future episode. Here are Kristen Holmes and Brad Schoenfeld.
So for today's conversation, we're going to focus on muscle growth, also known as hypertrophy. To lay the foundation, Brad, I'd love for you to start by defining hypertrophy, and if you can also kind of simultaneously define strength training as well. And then we can, kind of dig into where they're similar and where they're different.
Yeah, sure. Hypertrophy is, in simple terms, the growth we're talking about muscle hypertrophy, the growth of muscle tissue. And that can be measured in multiple ways. We can look at muscle thickness, which is a single dimensional measurement. We can look at cross-sectional area, which is a 2-dimensional measurement, or a volume, which is the entire muscle. That would be a 3-dimensional measurement. There's many ways that muscle can be measured: MRI, ultrasound, DEXA. And some of them, I don't know how deep you want to go, but some of them are more accurate than others in that realm. And strength training, I like to use the term resistance training. I mean, strength training, if you're talking about training for strength, because that's the connotation it gives, that would be different from the catch-all, which is resistance training. So resistance training is using any type of resistance to create force on the muscles. Whereas to me, strength training is a focus on gaining strength, which is not necessarily dependent on gaining hypertrophy, although there is a relationship between hypertrophy and strength. There are other factors that go into gaining strength outside of hypertrophy.
From the standpoint of just benefits, I know there's overlap and there's a lot of similarities in the benefits between growing muscles and getting stronger. Are there any benefits, I guess, with hypertrophy training versus strength training that people need to understand?
Yeah. So first of all, it's population specific, it's goal specific. Most younger individuals are training for aesthetics. Not all, but certainly based on my previous experience as a personal trainer, the vast majority of people that came in were less concerned about maxing their strength and more concerned about how they looked. As people get older, strength becomes of much greater importance, because it's important to dependence or independence, your dependence on others to help you to carry out
Mhm.
activities versus your ability to carry out those activities. So certainly that would be, somewhat context dependent. But I mean, if you're asking, there are certainly other benefits besides aesthetics to muscle itself. And one of them, from a health standpoint, being the size of a muscle will be related to the amount of glucose that can be stored in that muscle. So, thus, conceivably, larger muscles can help to reduce insulin insensitivity.
Mhm.
If you can store more glucose, you're going to have greater or a lesser chance of being insulin resistant and a lesser chance of ultimately becoming diabetic. But look, from a health standpoint, I think strength is the more important. If you're asking my personal opinion, I think there's
Mhm.
certainly good evidence to back that up. Strength, especially over time, is going to be the more important factor from a health standpoint. But that
Mhm.
doesn't, people need to train based on their goals. And it's not up to
Right.
me or you or anyone else to tell someone why they should be training.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how you always say that everything's context dependent, and people, when they go in to start any activity, need to be thinking about their goals and their level of experience. And maybe, are there different considerations, if you're a beginner, do you start with strength, or do you start with hypertrophy? What would be your personal, your opinion based on the research that you've
So
done?
neither.
Oh, okay.
You should,
Interesting.
in my opinion, you should focus on learning movements. So it's
Mm,
motor learning, basically. It should be the focus in the initial 1, 2, 3 months or so. It's your initial phase of training should, at least the way I approach it and always have, is to try to ingrain the movement patterns into the subconscious. Once you
mhm,
have mastered the movement patterns, then you focus on whatever it is you are, then it's goal dependent.
mhm.
So I personally feel that the most important thing, and I think it's kind of tough to argue with it, that if you don't know how to do a movement, you're not going to be able to move to the next step. So
Right.
if you're performing something poorly, you're not going. You'll have suboptimal results, whether it's strength, hypertrophy, muscle endurance, or whatever. So learning those movements is central to taking that next step.
Amazing. So what would be, if we're starting, maybe we can kind of move through beginner, intermediate, advanced. And, if the goal is to increase muscle size, what would be kind of the repetitions, the frequency, kind of how would you program across those three levels broadly? I know obviously it's, there's non-competition folks, so just kind of thinking about the general population, but someone who's beginner versus intermediate versus experienced.
So, from my perspective, the training should become more individualized and specialized as you become more advanced. In the
Hmm.
sense, from a volume perspective, that when you're an intermediate and first developing your muscles, you just want to develop all the muscles as much as they will
Hmm.
develop. But as you start to become somewhat more advanced, you then want to look at what muscles are more well developed and which muscles are less well developed. And you can allocate more volume to the muscles that are less developed and less volume to the muscles that are more well
Hmm.
developed, so that your overall training volume doesn't change that much from the total amount of work that you're doing, total amount of sets that you're doing across all muscles, but that you're apportioning it kind of like a budget
Hmm.
towards muscles that might need it more. And again, this is where the art of training
Hmm.
comes in. So it's, there are no cookie cutter. I know everyone wants to like to just do this many sets and this many reps, and that's just not the way it works in an applied science. We all,
Yeah, go deep.
if that worked that way, everyone would be Mr. Olympia because everyone would have the same physique, and that just doesn't happen. So we respond differently as humans. So volume certainly is an important concern. I think one of the most important things that probably the most important thing from a hypertrophy standpoint is proximity to failure.
Hmm.
So training close to failure. I think the literature is now showing that we don't necessarily need to train to failure, certainly at least all the time. Whether some failure training might be beneficial is somewhat equivocal, but I think the evidence is becoming, you know, fairly clear that you can achieve optimal hypertrophy if you're within a couple reps of failure. But you need to train. That's still training very hard. You're training a couple reps away from failure. And I think most people don't know their proximity to failure. Most people never really have trained. To know how far you are away from failure, you need to train to failure. And thus, training really hard is important. And perhaps then some failure training might be beneficial, particularly as you're getting more advanced. And again, these are individual things that you can't just give a one size fits all.
Talk about the utility of a 1 rep max and kind of understanding where that kind of moderate to heavy load might actually be for you.
Yeah. So personally, I don't think having a 1 RM, if you're looking for hypertrophy, to me, I think it's pretty irrelevant. I think you want to pick a repetition range. So I'll give you for instance. Let's say you want to train at 80% of your 1 RM on squats. For you, that might be 10 reps. For another person, it might be 15 reps. For another person, it might be 6 reps. So the variation between individuals in percent 1 RM versus a submax lift is very vast. So, and by the way, I'll
Right.
give you a better, for instance. We carried out a study some time ago where we had subjects going to failure with a leg press at 75% 1 RM and 30% 1 RM. In the 75% 1 RM, the variation, we had 11 well-trained subjects. The variation in reps went from 7 to 21. Someone got 7 reps
Wow.
at 75% and at the highest
It's
end
huge
21.
variability.
At 30%, it was, if I'm recalling, somewhere around 22 in the lowest and 72 or 70 something in the highest. So, I mean, a 50
Yeah.
repetition range
Wow.
across individuals. So, again, it really underscores the importance that you can't use a 1 RM to predict a submax repetition
Right.
max. So for me, you want to look at repetition zones from a hypertrophy standpoint. Now, if you're looking for strength, then your 1 RM is going to be, of course, much more important because training
Right.
closer to your 1 RM is going to be mandatory if you want to maximize your 1 RM.
Right.
But from a hypertrophy standpoint, I tend to look more in loading zones. So you, let's say, have a heavier loading zone, 3 to 5 reps, a moderate repetition zone, 8 to 12, and a higher rep zone, 15, 20, 25 plus. And from that context, they're really up to at least 30 plus reps, some perhaps probably even a little higher. It really does not make much difference on a whole muscle level which rep range you train in. The literature, and this is something I've kind of done a 180 on over the years. When I was an up and coming student, it had always been preached that you should train in this magical hypertrophy zone of 8 to 12 reps, and
Right.
that it's going to increase your hormonal milieu and other
Yeah.
factors which will maximize results. And really, that has not panned out in research from our lab and others. I think to me, this is one of the most compelling bodies of evidence of any of the variables, probably the most compelling, that you can achieve whole muscle hypertrophy across a broad spectrum of ranges. Now, with that said, I do think that it makes sense to train in a majority of your sets within that moderate rep range, kind of 8 to 12, 6 to 12. But I do think there's at least some evidence that using some lighter and heavier loads sprinkled in also can enhance that effect. And it's possible, although there's certainly conflicting evidence on this, that you might be able to alter fiber type differences, where lighter loads might target your type 1 fibers to a greater extent, and your heavier loads, somewhat heavier loads, might target your type 2 fibers. I think that's an area that needs more exploration, although I'm becoming less convinced that that might be the case. But I do think we do have some evidence that for various other reasons, there might be beneficial effects of training across the spectrum of loading ranges.
Do you think, are there any different recommendations you would have from in terms of just age? So if you're just starting out, do you recommend children, lift, and what would that recommendation be? And then kind of as we age, just wanted to get your kind of opinion across the age spectrum and what you'd recommend, differently, or if maybe it's the same.
No, absolutely. So first of all, I think children should start lifting as soon as they are mentally mature enough. So they have to be able to focus, if they're all over the place. But I mean, children as young as 5 and 6, certainly, depending on their mental maturity, can start to lift. Now, I personally would start them with lighter loads. Well, I would start anyone with lighter loads, but even
Mhm.
maintain fairly somewhat lighter loads, at least throughout the majority of childhood and into adolescence. When I say lighter, I wouldn't be doing singles and doubles, one arms. But I mean, 5, 6 reps plus, I think would be appropriate in that age group.
Can you just do a little myth busting around strength training and hindering the development of puberty? And just would love to
Yeah,
get
Z-
clear the air there.
zero zero
Okay.
evidence of that. Zero evidence that it will stunt children's growth, and in fact, so the issue with growth is always centered on that it negatively affects the growth plates, which there's no evidence of. What can affect the growth plates negatively is an injury to the bone. And where might now could that happen in resistance training? It can if you're not careful. But if you are in a supervised format, which by the way, any children, I would certainly recommend that they do that. Certainly before until they're teenagers in a supervised environment. I wouldn't generally recommend an 8-year-old be just going into the basement lifting on their own or even a gym. But the chances of getting hurt, and people, parents have their children play sports. The chances of getting a bone injury in basketball or soccer or football certainly is much greater, much greater than it is in resistance training. And that's where you can get an injury to the bone that would affect the
Mhm.
growth plates and potentially stunt growth. So I think
Right.
parents worrying about that, or people in general worrying about that, is a little disingenuous if you're going to
Mhm.
have your kids play sports. And I don't see most parents not allowing their children to play sports.
Right.
And from an older person standpoint, it again will then be individual specific. Now, generally speaking, so as people age, there's a high incidence of osteoarthritis and bone related issues, which often will, if not contraindicate heavier loads, make them uncomfortable to use. So that's an area where utilizing lighter loads, it's really beautiful that training with lighter loads has a really a very high beneficial effect on muscle development. It is not as great for strength, although you still will get stronger. And I will argue that from a functional standpoint, you'll probably, I don't think it's going to make a much difference in an older person's ability to carry out functional tasks. Most people are not looking to maximally push something, especially most older people. They're looking for more muscle endurance related. The functional aspects of aging are on muscle
Mhm.
endurance related qualities, which would be very specific to the lighter load training as well. What I would say as you get older, and this is not really a hypertrophy factor, but one of the most detrimental effects on aging is the loss of power. And power is strength over time, basically. It's the ability
Mhm.
to carry out force over time. And again, one of the most detrimental things that occurs is a fall. So older people often will have a fall, they'll break their hip. And the last statistics I've seen is that something like 50+% of those of elderly individuals who get a hip fracture never recover from that injury. And that is a function of power. So if you are falling, the ability to reverse direction and retain your balance is basically a function of power. So it's strength,
Right.
but you have to be able to enforce that strength in a very short period of time. And there is emerging evidence that training with faster concentric repetitions, more explosive concentric repetitions, will help to improve the power, particularly in older individuals.
Mhm.
Our group carried out a meta analysis on this topic and found a modest benefit. to at least doing some training with faster concentric actions. It doesn't mean that all your sets need to be done fast concentrically, but at least including some training that involves fast concentric actions would be appropriate.
Amazing. How many would you recommend folks, lift 5 days a week, just alternating muscle groups? Like, do you have a sense of what's most effective?
So you can get bigger muscles with a fairly basic type of routine and fairly low
Mhm.
volume routine. So there's an added value to volume, but the plateau, so it's not like you just get a linear increase. The As you start getting more and more sets, the added value of those sets becomes less. Doesn't mean it's non-existent, and at some point it does become non-existent. But this is why it is, like I said, would depend upon if you just want bigger muscle. You say, yeah, someone wants to come in. You get your average guy who's coming in or gal and says, I want to get bigger muscles. A 3-day a week routine, 4-day a week routine would be
Mhm.
certainly sufficient. If you're
Mhm.
talking about a bodybuilder, I think some of that training, if you're asking me how I would program, it would generally
Mhm.
be in cycles, in blocks of
Right.
training where that would go from somewhat lower frequency to higher. And I think at some point you need to be, at least for a short period of time, to get in the sufficient volume to maximize results at a 5 or 6 day a week
Right.
frequency. But the majority of training, I think, if you structure it properly, can be carried out quite well within 3 to 4 days.
Mhm. And would you say you need 24 hours, 48 hours before kind of hitting the same muscle group again? Like, what would be that recovery time between you wouldn't want to lift your quadriceps, for example, 2 days in a row? So, kind of, what does the research say in terms of how much time you need between training muscle groups?
So it's interesting. There is actually some conflicting evidence on this, and there's been a few studies that have suggested. Well, one in particular, although it was never published, suggested that training 6 days a week, the same muscles over and over, was actually more effective than doing it 3 days a week. But more recent evidence,
Mm.
our group published a study on this. It interestingly doesn't seem to show as much of a detriment depending upon how it's structured if the
Mhm.
volumes are lower in each session. But personally, I don't think that's the best way to train. And I think having 48 hours rest between muscles is generally a good rule of thumb. Now,
Yeah.
remember, outside of the lower body, or even with, depending upon how you structure lower body training, that could be an issue. But when you train the upper body, there's going to be overlap. So you think, let's say you're doing a back,
Right.
so you're training your back, you're getting your biceps involved. So then if you're going to train your biceps on the same day or if you're training it on a different day, you're training it can you train it the next day? Or do you have to now then show, let's say you're doing your shoulders and your chest, your triceps generally are going to be involved, at least in some of those movements. So again, there's going to be it starts to get somewhat hazy when you're talking
Mm.
about direct versus indirect effects. And even, by the way, people often don't consider this, but a lat pull down works the sternal portion of the pecs. Now, how
Mhm.
much work does that get? Is that really going to fatigue the chest where you're not going to be able to come back the next day? I think that's highly debatable, but it's
Mhm.
just pointing out that it's not clean like a lot of people think, that when you're training back, you're just working your back musculature. The
Right.
body doesn't work in that context.
What are some of the recovery modalities that you recommend, for folks who are really trying to make gains and are, in the gym, 5, 6 days a week? Are there kind of certain things that you recommend from a recovery modalities
Well,
perspective?
rest. um, so,
Yeah.
but to me, the most important recovery modality is an active recovery. You don't want to just be lying on your bed, because
Hmm.
blood flow itself, delivering nutrient, your body quote unquote recovers through nutrient delivery, and that is facilitated through greater blood flow, which is diminished when you are very sedentary. So, doing some type of walking. Other than that, a lot of it comes down to personal preference. I think a massage can be, I don't think that necessarily helps with recovery, that it's necessarily beneficial from a mechanistic standpoint. But I think anything that mentally makes you
Yeah.
feel better, such as foam rolling, massage, can be effective in that respect. Although I don't feel that most of those modalities have good evidence from a mechanistic standpoint.
Right.
I think there's some good evidence that psychologically they can make you feel like you're better recovered, which is going to get you better workouts, which is fine. So a placebo effect can be very good.
Yeah, absolutely.
But whether that actually is doing anything to you, I'm still not convinced.
I know you spend a lot of time in the nutrition world. Are there any things from a nutritional standpoint that you would recommend? Protein immediately, post training, or yeah, is there anything you can say about? I think protein would be really beneficial for our listeners.
Yeah, so getting in enough protein daily, I think, is number one, is the
Mm.
critical factor. And that's going to be, if you're resistance training, a minimum of around 1.6 grams per kilogram a day. And probably,
Mhm.
I generally recommend a little higher as a safety margin, around
Mhm.
grams per kilogram, which is just under a gram per pound or so,
Pound. Mhm.
for our American friends.
Yeah, thanks.
The rest of the world is on the metric system. So,
Totally.
the timing aspect is another area where I've done kind of a 180 on. I used to feel it was
Mm.
a very important, so even critical factor. And now, again, the more recent evidence seems to show that if it has a benefit, it's going to be small. And I generally think that as long as you're spacing out your protein across 3 to 4 meals a day, that are
Mhm.
fairly evenly spaced throughout the day, the timing is superfluous. It kind of takes care of itself.
So well, it's good to hear that we don't have to freak out about the timing necessarily, as long as we're kind of spreading it out throughout the day. I would say bodybuilders probably are thinking about like getting it right after training. Even you said it's marginal, but there probably
Yeah.
is.
So
Yeah,
if
but
you're a bodybuilder, to me, do recommend that bodybuilders take a protein shake
yeah,
immediately after training. When I say immediately, in close proximity
yeah,
to their following their training bout, because there's no downside to it. If there's a benefit, it's going to be small, but for a bodybuilder, small differences can be the difference between potentially winning and losing a competition. I don't think for the average individual it's going to make any difference
yeah.
visually, but when your body fat's very low and you can add, a few extra ounces of muscle, even that could be practically meaningful.
What would you say from the standpoint of if folks are adding cardio? Is there? I know the general recommendation is, again, it's probably going to differ, from person to person. But would you say that if my focus is on my lifting program and I'm really interested in muscle growth, should I prioritize that first and do cardio second? What would be the order of operation from your standpoint?
Yeah, so if you're going to do the cardio and lifting in the same session, you prioritize. And as a general rule, cardio is going to negatively or can negatively affect your lifting session. There really is no good evidence that lifting negatively affects your cardio session to much of a
Right.
degree, but that would also be dependent upon what you do in the cardio session. So certainly prioritize lifting if your goal is to maximize muscle building strength. There is evidence that if you do cardio first, you're going to have negative effects on your lifting session.
Yeah. Is there any evidence? I guess I'd love to hear what you recommend for a warm up before lifting. To really maximize your lifting session. What should you do in advance of the session?
So this kind of comes down to where you're coming from. So if you're coming out of a
Mm.
cold environment, like if you're walking
Yeah.
in the cold to a gym, I'd recommend getting on a bike or a treadmill and
Hmm.
doing a 5-10 minute, brief warm up, general warm up. When it comes to a specific, and by the way, if you're warm, that's generally not going to be a issue from a lifting standpoint.
Hmm.
And I can get into, we actually carried out a study on this.
Oh yeah, I'd love to hear.
If the goal is lifting heavy, then I recommend doing some specific warm up sets with the lighter weights. So let's say you're going to do a 3 RM. You're looking to get a 3 RM. You're best served by doing, let's say, a warm up set with 50% of your 1 RM, and then go up. So let's say 8 reps at 50%, and then do 4 or 5 reps at 75%, and then do your 3 RM. If you're training in the moderate to higher rep range, above certainly 8 or so reps, really no good reason that you need to do a specific warm up. And we actually carried out a study where we had groups we had the same individuals, and they were kind of, it was a crossover study, but they did just the resistance training with sub maximal weights, 8 to 10 reps. We had another time they did a general warm up, and another time they did a specific warm up, and another time they did a general and a specific warm up before the lifting. Really did not have an effect. Now, where it starts to become a little more complicated is with your more complex exercises. So if you're going to squat, I think that's an area where you might consider doing a specific warm up just to kind of get the groove to a squat. And that again is more specific to the individual, depending upon how heavy you're going to squat and other factors. The absolute, not the relative. But for the most part, above 8 reps or so, the warm up seems to become superfluous.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely know, like when I'm cold, it takes me a couple sets to get into it. So yeah, I think for me personally, I know you always say this, it's context dependent and it's very personal. So people just have to figure out what works best for them.
Yep.
I'd love to get into just as we kind of wrap things up, I just have a couple pretty specific questions. When we're talking about kind of rest between sets for hypertrophy, like what, how much time do I need between sets, generally speaking?
So as a general rule, 2 to 3 minutes rest seems to be,
Okay.
I don't want to say optimal, but 2 to 3 minutes rest seems to be a good general rule of thumb. However, that is more specific to multi-joint exercise, particularly more complex exercises. For your smaller muscle groups, so single joint exercises, generally you could get away with 90 seconds or so somewhat shorter rest. So this is where, again, it's going to somewhat depend upon your time factor. Now, if you're going to take 3 minutes rest, it's going to limit the amount of sets that you can do. And I think that we actually just carried out a study that was recently published showing there's not really much difference between 2 and 3 minutes rest. So again, somewhat specific to the individual. Some people buffer lactic acid to a greater extent, but when you're training with your moderate rep range, so 10 RM, 12 RM, 2 minutes rest at least in the squat, which is a really taxing exercise.
Yeah.
And the leg extension did not seem to have differential benefits. There seemed to be a greater negative effect of 1 minute rest versus 2 minutes rest in the squat than on the leg extension. So that's why, again, for your smaller muscle groups, your single joint exercises, there does seem to be less of a reason to take somewhat longer rest intervals.
Okay. So from the perspective of just within a program, if you could just kind of talk about progressive overload quickly and why it's important for muscle growth.
Yeah, so the basis of progressive overload is to progressively challenge your muscles beyond their present state. And this is actually, I think, an area where a lot of people don't understand the term, because progressive overload, I think because the term load is in the word, they think that it's just making weight heavier over time. And that certainly is one way to progressively overload. But you can progressively overload using higher volumes, greater frequency, shorter restorations, increased density of training. So training, more work in less time, more stimulus in less time, and other manners. So I think this is a key point here, that you can use different techniques. It's not like you have to use one or the other. You can meld those techniques into your training, and that's why training really is an art. Yeah. I would also say that, well, I'll provide this context. we carried out a study where we had one group so they started at a 10 RM for their squat. We did a lower body, so squat, leg extension, calf raise, straight leg calf raise, and bent leg calf raise. They started out at a 10 RM. One group, and this was fully supervised, trained individuals, we had them increase the load as they were getting stronger, keeping that 10 RM. So they tried to keep that 10 repetition. The other group, we kept them at whatever weight they started at, they used for the entire training program, and they just did more reps. So there was all training to failure. And at the end of the study, no differences in hypertrophy.
Both were effective.
Which really underscores the fact that there's more than one way to, or my favorite saying is, many roads lead to gains.
Yeah,
so
I love that.
You can use different approaches, and they're equally effective in this manner.
That's awesome. I mean, some people just prefer more reps and lighter weight, just not, and other people really like the heavier weight. So that's
and you can mix and match. You can do a block where you are increasing reps, and the next block you can look to increase the load and continue. So it really is specific to the individual and how they decide to what they enjoy and how they decide to program.
Right. Cool. Okay. Final question. We ask this all of our guests this question. What are you obsessing over right now?
What am I
is there a specific research question or just something in the kind of in your field that you're really like?
I am obsessing over mentoring my students to be the next generation of exercise scientists, really to carry on a legacy. And I am very proud I will always give a shout out to my students because they facilitate my ability to do what I do. And I have a terrific group of students who are in their masters. I'm the director of our master's program, and they're many of them are carrying out theses. And my focus at this point in life is to mentor, and I obsess over that. So.
Well, they're so lucky to have you. They must be beating down the door to get into your program. So that's incredible. Final question. What are the 3 keys to a successful hypertrophy-based workout program?
Yeah, so you need to train hard, sufficiently hard. You need to progressively overload, and you need to recover properly. I would say there's obviously a lot of nuances within those, but those are 3 primary keys.
I love it. Well, Brad, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on today and spending this time with us. Brad, where can folks find you? I know I follow you on Instagram, so I know that you post studies and are really active there. If you can just share your handle, we'll also share that in the show notes.
Yeah, I'm all over social media. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter. I still do Facebook. So yeah, you Google me. I would just say Google me and you'll find me.
Perfect. Well, thank you for being an educator and that's Herculean what you've contributed to this space, to say the least. So thank you for all that you've done. Yeah, grateful.
My pleasure.
Thank you to Brad Schoenfeld for joining us today to talk about resistance training and hypertrophy. If you enjoyed this episode of the Whoop Podcast, be sure to leave a rating or review. Check us out on social @Whoop, @WillAhmed. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us, podcast@Whoop. Call us 508-443-4952, and it might just be answered on a future episode. If you're thinking about joining Whoop, you can now sign up for Whoop for free. That's right, free 30 days. If you like it, become a member. If you don't, send it back. New members can use the code WILL, WILL, to get a $60 credit on Whoop accessories when you enter the code at checkout for your new membership. That's a wrap, folks. Thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next week on the Whoop Podcast. Get sculpted, get ripped, use these new tips, try the strength trainer in the Whoop app, and as always, stay healthy and stay in the green.